I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London with an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me, dealing with a subject that literally crosses all continents, namely, what is to be done with the returning fighters of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist fighting groups that have been at war in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere for that matter, and who are now headed for a crushing military defeat, which will not be the end of them ideologically, of course, and unless they're all killed on the battlefield, some or most of them are going to try to return to the places from whence they came, which includes Britain and includes France and Belgium and Holland and Germany and all over Europe, and for that matter, all over the Arab world and even as far away as Southeast Asia. They're going to be a problem for the security services. Indeed, obviously, they already are. Britain is in the grip of yet another emergency. Another terror outrage has led to the police scurrying hither and thither, blue lights flashing as even innocent packages left in a railway station are enough to bring the whole city of London to a halt, albeit temporarily. I want to start off by looking at the history of this thing. Britain and the West are no strangers to stimulating Islamist organizations for whom, in truth, they probably have bottomless contempt, but the organizations are useful on the principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. This goes back a long way. But if we take the modern era in Egypt and in Iran in the 1950s against Nasser and Mossadegh, in Indonesia in the early 1960s against the leader Sukarno, the personification of the worldwide third way, the worldwide non-aligned movement, which was of course founded under Sukarno in Bandung in Indonesia. More recently, in the 1980s, we gave lock, stock and barrel everything that we could to the so-called Mujahideen who were fighting in Afghanistan to overthrow the government there, but really the target was the then Soviet Union, to turn Afghanistan into Russia's Vietnam. And that was, of course, a successful tactic. But more recently still, we are faced with the consequences of having built a Frankenstein monster, which came to power across a huge swathe of Iraq and for a time controlled about half of the territory of Syria, only to founder and only to lose. So we dressed all these people up and now they have nowhere to go except back from whence they came. So the security industry, and it's well represented here in this audience tonight, will have to have some pretty smart ideas as to how we stop the war blowing back on us. It already has, of course, to a very considerable degree. Over the last couple of years, 3 years perhaps, there has been a wave of bombings and often coordinated terrorist activities that have spilled blood in very copious amounts and have cost billions of pounds to the metropolitan countries who sent these jihadists to fight in the first place. As I've told you before, but it's worth retelling, I was once trapped in a lift with the then British Foreign Secretary, William Hague. He had just returned from Jordan, where he had successfully announced the lifting of an arms embargo on the so-called Syrian rebels. Imagine Mr. Haig's bad luck when just me and him in the lift, and the lift stopped, and he had no idea how long it was stopped for. And I said to him, William, you've been wrong before. In fact, you've been wrong most of your life, but you've never been insane before. But the policy that you're following now of giving knives to people as long as the throats they cut are in Syria, you have to know either your proteges will succeed, in which case on the Mediterranean itself we'll have an ISIS Al-Qaeda state, or if you lose, all these people to whom you've given knives will come back here to Britain, to this building. They'll be in this building, I said, looking for you and looking for me. Not so long ago, that prophecy came absolutely true. As one of these so-called jihadists, I don't like using the term because jihad is an honorable word, or should be, but those who misuse the word jihad armed themselves with those very knives and entered the British Parliament precincts itself, killing a police officer, and if they had got past him, they would have killed plenty more. So it's a very big conundrum. It's one partly of our own making, not wholly of our own making. Sykes-Picot is a contributor. British support for Israel is a contributor. The British and American assault on Iraq is a contributor. All of these things are contributors, but they're not the whole story. They're the truth, but not the whole truth. And this is not an academic exercise, because if we don't succeed in getting to grips with this phenomenon, then the state of terror alert that we all live under in Western countries is going to continue throughout the lifetime of every person present in this room today, however young they now are. Let me throw this debate to our experts first of all. I'm always happy to ask Charles Shoebridge, a considerable security expert, to give your analysis, Charles, if you would, on how we got here and how we're going to get out of here.
George, it's always a pleasure to be here as well. Your analysis for me, of course, it won't surprise you, anybody that's followed my work on Twitter and elsewhere over the last 5 or 6 years, is absolutely spot on. Britain and the West have seen an opportunity with so-called jihad to further their own geopolitical goals, to encourage, to certainly not put any impediments in the way of people traveling from the United Kingdom, Belgium, and so on, to go to countries like Syria, and another country that actually you haven't mentioned, but I know you certainly will want to mention, Libya especially, to create chaos there, to overthrow governments that, notwithstanding, only a year or two previously were considered allies of Britain, allies of United States, to then seek the overthrow and the destruction of those countries, to ally ourselves with forces which, if they were operating in Britain, would be absolutely considered terrorists. Indeed, if we look at organizations such as IS, Islamic State so-called, or Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, remember that the main fighting force, almost since the outset of the Syrian war, has been the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Nusra Front. It's changed its name now in an attempt to rebrand itself somehow as more moderate, of course. But one way or another, that organization has been prescribed by the United Nations, by the UK, by the US, by the EU as a terrorist organization. And yet countries such as Britain have, it must be knowingly, have supplied so-called non-lethal equipment. This non-lethal equipment, for example, you mentioned William Hague when he announced that non-lethal equipment. And when you looked at the details, it was body armor, armored vehicles, night sights for weapons. It was GPS-type materials, secure radio equipment, all stuff that is used to enhance the lethality of weapons, which, of course, were being supplied to these rebels by backdoor routes that could be deniable, via the Balkans, for example, and that has been since proven. He was adamant that they would not fall into, William Hague, the so-called wrong hands of the extremists. But anybody that knew, even in 2012, the state of the battlefield as it was in Iraq, I beg your pardon, in Syria, and as it had been in Libya just the year before, and indeed continues to this day, knows that it was absolutely impossible to retain control of those weapons and equipment that was going to so-called moderate rebels who actually on any decent analysis from people on the ground would recognise did not really in any substantial form exist. So you have to ask whether people knew that actually these weapons would fall into the wrong hands, which is the reason they supplied them to groups who then handed them, sold them, or defected with their weapons to these extremist groups in a first instance. Also, there's a lot of documentary evidence, remember, to show that people knew. For example, the WikiLeaks revelations of what Hillary Clinton knew about the situation in Libya and Syria when she was still supporting these groups, notwithstanding knowing that they were extremist linked, and also that they were backed by countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar that had absolutely no interest whatsoever in furthering democracy, let alone, or perhaps even more so, a Sunni democracy that would threaten their own countries in the Middle East region. Now, and I will just finish off very briefly with this, I particularly agree with your use or your allusion to the phrase of blowback, the concept there. It's implicit in the definition of blowback that it's at least partly self-inflicted. And that is now what we're seeing, and what people like myself and others, including you and others, many others, predicted, that when we were backing and predicted in 2011, 2012, that the people we are backing will end up turning on us, and that eventually we will see US, UK drones over Libya, over Syria, killing the very people that we were then using as proxies to further our own geopolitical objectives. And what were those geopolitical objectives? They were to further the economic interests of the United Kingdom, for sure. For example, there are issues about pipelines and so on going across Syria, but also in terms of supporting the aims and the policies of people that we consider vital allies. And these are particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel. And if you think about this, with the British foreign policy so far and American foreign policy, we think, people often say, oh, these were mistaken policies because they ended up in mass destruction. Far from it. How many times can countries such as Britain, with such long histories of successful diplomacy in terms of creating empires, forging enormous wars, furthering their own economic interests, how many times do they make mistakes before we say these actually cannot have been mistakes? The destruction of countries such as Libya, Israel, Iraq have really benefited only certain groups. They are arms companies without doubt. They are oil companies based in the West, and they have definitely benefited countries such as Israel, for whom those nations were existential threats. Whereas, in contrast, to groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which incidentally has never attacked Israel, and Israel has never attacked them, even if they did, they would not be existential threats. And that's where you have to ask the question, when it comes to blowback, have our governments actually made conscious decisions, or perhaps elements within those governments, that the lives of citizens who die in places such as Manchester and London are actually a price worth paying in terms of blowback, because it was predictable and predicted, including by MI5 chiefs, in order to get the economic and geopolitical benefits on a big scale that undoubtedly for British foreign policy have resulted. And now ordinary people are paying the price of that.
Well, perfectly put. It begs what the Americans used to call the $64,000 question, when that was a lot of money. Is our security policy, therefore, given what you've said and what I said before you, is our security policy written by fools or knaves, by James Bond or Mr. Bean? It's very difficult to work out. On the face of it, it's blunder after blunder after blunder after blunder. Are we really led by such fools? Would it be better to be led by fools than knaves? Who knows? What's your view?
Having worked with the security services quite closely in the past, I can say with confidence that it's probably a mixture of the two. And of course, they're not inconsistent, that these people can be incompetent even in their policies that are perhaps not what they appear to be. But certainly when one looks at the bigger picture, particularly of British actions in Libya, then in British actions in and I'm using Britain as an example because what Britain is doing, also America is doing. Although Britain is a world leader in this game of subterfuge and
Yes, indeed.
and clandestine activities, as you've indeed outlined.
Chess players.
Exactly, and masterful at it. And I think the world, including Russian diplomats I've spoken to in the past, they all acknowledge Britain's great skill over centuries in manipulating, dividing and ruling and creating situations to the benefit not necessarily of British people, but of a British elite, shall we say, that is in charge of or benefits from, for example, the security industry, the oil industry, the arms industry generally. And if you like, I can come back to that later.
Well, we are going to come back to it. I want to just use this first part of the program to look at the history of all of this. Let me give an example that might persuade the skeptical. Colonel Nasser coming to power in Egypt with a powerful Arab nationalist message, seeking to unite the Arabs, then 250 million strong, as a bloc of their own, with their own interests, with a common language and common religions and so on. This was a mortal threat to Britain in the 1950s. It was a mortal threat to the United States. It was a mortal threat to the kings and one or two puppet presidents at that time, who we had placed in power precisely so that that message would not spread, that the Arabs would not unite, that they would remain balkanized. So the British looked at all kinds of ways that they could undermine, subvert, weaken, if possible, destroy, even assassinate. They had many plans to assassinate Colonel Nasser at the time, but they discovered that a pretty useful way was to pick people with whom they had even less in common in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood at that time, to stimulate them as an alternative to Arab nationalism to cause problems for Nasser. I myself, with my own eyes, saw a similar ploy in practice. And here I have to be careful. I'm not at all suggesting that Hamas are in any sense agents of imperialism or any such ludicrous charge as that. I'm not suggesting that for 1 second. But I saw Hamas being conjured into being by Israel. I saw them with my own eyes. I saw the period in which the PLO under Arafat were suppressed at every turn, whilst the constituent parts of what became Hamas were allowed freely to operate, have their own schools, their own colleges, their own kindergartens, their vehicles driving everywhere, their cadre able to move around. Not because Israel liked Hamas, how could they? Not, and of course, in this case, there's been a blowback on that because Hamas became a very powerful resistance organization against the occupation of Palestine. But they were undoubtedly, even their best friend couldn't deny this, they were undoubtedly assisted into being, and the midwife was the State of Israel, which was doing the same thing as we did in Egypt in the 50s, working on the premise that my enemy's enemy is my friend. But of course, very often, your enemy turns out to be, your enemy's enemy turns out to be worse than your enemy, turns out to be a more serious challenge to you and to your interests. I used to regularly ask British Prime Ministers on the floor of the House of Commons if they'd read Mary Shelley's epic novel, Frankenstein. And if they had they read it to the end? Because, of course, if you did read it to the end, you'd know that you can build a monster, but once you built it, you're no longer in control of it. That's why it's called a monster. And it breaks free from you and no longer does what you would like it to do. We have another distinguished security analyst and expert in the room. I'm going to take him in this second segment of the show after we see some vox pops from the people in London. I'm George Galloway. This is كلمة on Al-Mayadeen television. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing the issue of the returning so-called jihadists of the alphabet soup that has been fighting and partially destroying the republics of Iraq and Syria over this last couple of years. We took the Mayadeen camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Have a look at this.
What are the recent news you heard about ISIS?
Well, I think ISIS is a group of terrorists, and they are just focusing on, how to just terrorize people, and then I think they are not even Muslims. So that's all I know about it. Every time when I hear a news, it's about ISIS, that they killed this many people, and all about that. So it's basically a group of terrorists.
It's a group that they made up to put Muslims in bad daylight, and they just want to talk trash about us, and because we are Muslims. And
what do you know about ISIS? What are the recent news you heard about ISIS?
That they do a lot of terrorist attacks, and that it's an organization that supports terrorists.
They're evil, death, that sort of thing.
Ooh, what do I know about it? Not a whole lot, really.
Do you believe if they lost their state, that means they are defeated completely, or could they remain a threat?
Well, I think that it's, as far as I've heard, that they are spread everywhere. So even if they are defeated in some part, then maybe they are somewhere else as well. Maybe they have a group somewhere else, and they should be, defeated everywhere.
You know that they've lost their territory in the Middle East.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. Because it's founded by some underground networks, and I don't trust that. I don't believe that. So it's like a whole complot to me.
Do you think the terror threat in Europe and the UK is increasing or decreasing at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's increasing.
Well, one or two of the public there, particularly the fellow who said he was a Muslim, still living in that well-known Egyptian river, denial. The idea that somehow ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't exist, or that they are merely puppets being operated by, I think he inferred, Western powers, perhaps Israel and so on. This is quite widely held amongst British Muslims, and it's fantastically untrue, perhaps unfortunately. Now, we're joined by another security expert, Mike Yardley, a very experienced man. Mike, sticking for a moment to the historical, we'll come on to what we're going to do next. How do you view the analysis that Charles Shoebridge and I made at the beginning of the show?
Charles made a very interesting point earlier, and that is that countries act in their own national interest. And when you look at what's going on now, as ever, that's what's happening, whether it's the US, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's the UK. One thing I think which was not said, I'm quite comfortable with the idea, if that's the right way of putting it, that we are acting partly in the wars that we've seen in the Middle East on behalf of the oil industry and the arms industry. I think they have exerted a quite improper and immoral influence. But I think we should have put some of the blame at Tony Blair's, at his front door, because
I'm never usually remiss in doing that.
Indeed.
So thank you for filling in for me.
He took us into this catastrophic war, which has had so many dreadful consequences, not least the death of hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million people in total when you take in all the factors. We don't know. Nobody's ever actually released the casualty figures. I've got some interesting personal perspectives on this. I was in Beirut in 1982, and I was seized off the street. I was working for Time magazine. I was a photographer. And I was seized off the street by a secular terrorist group. And in 1982, when I was in Beirut, and I was covering what was happening in Syria as well, we were dealing with secular terrorists. People forget that. You see a lot of foolish comment on Twitter now, a lot of Islamophobic comment about Muslims generally, and they forget how old this technique of terror is. I define terror as the use
or threat of extreme violence to create psychological casualties for political ends. You can take it back to the Romans in the UK context. You can certainly take it back to Irish Republicans. We had tubes being bombed in London in the 1880s. That's how far it goes back. We had, the anarchists attack at Greenwich, and then early in the 20th century too. Very old technique. Of course, the Israelis were one of the originators of modern terrorism, the Stern Gang and similar. They were involved in using this method to put pressure on the British government. Similarly, however, not only was I in Beirut in the 1980s, where I fell foul and actually eventually got on quite well with the guys who'd captured me, they let me go. I was in Syria, and I was in Syria in Hama in 1982 when Assad's father was suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, we don't know how many casualties, there are various estimates, 10, 20, 30,000, and I very nearly did not escape that place. And that was a very scary place to be. So I always remember that experience of Syria, but also that generally Syria was a pretty good place then. I mean, quite a well-advanced, a civilized place, very unlike these dreadful pictures you see of whole cities that have been destroyed now. I was in Afghanistan in the 80s. Now, a long, long time ago, I was an army officer. I wasn't very good at taking orders, so I left the army. But I was in Afghanistan, and I had friends in the Mujahideen. And one of the things that was interesting there was to discover that the Mujahideen wasn't one coherent entity. It was loads of different parties, and a bit like various Palestinian factions in Beirut, they didn't like each other. They quite happily cut each other's throats sometimes, but they came together because there was a common enemy, the Russians. We talked about, arming ISIS and similar for the geopolitical interests of the Saudis or the US or ourselves. Of course, we were doing that in Afghanistan. We were supplying them with Stinger missiles and other things. And that did work as a strategy, as a military strategy. It worked. The problem was, when the Russians left, you had all these guys who'd got that military experience, who had much better armament than they had before, all these various warlords. And then what have we created? What about that Frankenstein monster you were talking about? The other thing which I think is interesting in this, and another personal insight, is we look at what's the history of the Middle East. I've written a biography of Lawrence of Arabia. I saw how Lawrence was involved with, of course, Faisal, Transjordan, Jordan as it became, Mesopotamia, Iraq as we now call it. We eventually put a puppet monarch into Mesopotamia, and then we policed the place with gas bombs from the air. Trenchard developed that policy. What we couldn't do, though, is we didn't really get Saudi, because we had our guy down in that area, Captain Shakespeare, but he was killed in 1915, as I remember, and the Americans then really developed that connection. And the Saudi-American alliance dates back really to about 1930. There was a famous meeting between the Americans and Ibn Saud. But the interesting thing here was that Saud himself came to power with an unholy alliance, really, with the Wahhabi priesthood. And they didn't really like each other very much. Indeed, he purged them periodically. But to this very day, that state is based in that conflict between the royal household and the priesthood. I think you can see a situation where if you were in the intelligence services of a country, and remember the intelligence services of most countries, certainly our own and the US, have some very clever, sharp, sensitive people. They know the countries they're dealing with. They're not fools. But as well as those people, if you want to call them their own party, you have industrial interests, you have the oil interests, the arms industry interests, and these people may sometimes be in some conflict. And I think that is also worth remembering when we're looking for the truth. But certainly it seems that it was in the geopolitical interest, possibly of the Saudis, possibly of the US, to push ISIS and use them in much the same way as they used the Mujahideen, the various different parties of the Mujahideen to eject the Soviets. Now, that's the Frankenstein monster. This is what you were talking about earlier. Yeah. Now, the question is, what's happening now?
Well, we'll come to that.
Yes, and I was going to say, let me just leave it on this. Yeah. I'm not sure I really know what's happening now, because it is such a difficult and clouded situation. But I think what we all need to do is we need to look through to the history. And I'll say one other thing. When I was in the Middle East not so long ago, I noticed I was the guest of a royal house, and I went walkabout in the country, and I wanted to see what was happening with fundamentalism simply in that country. And what I noticed were there were some very, very wealthy merchants who were not members of the ruling clique, who were backing the people who I would say we would call fundamentalists, because they were creating their own power base, an alternative power base, because they weren't allowed to the high table, but this allowed them a way of exerting influence.
Well, that all of what you said is extremely interesting and important. And the last point, I want to just test on our next expert, Professor Al-Masri, whom I have known for about 30 years now, I think. Professor Al-Masri was and is a Saudi dissident who knows the milieu, who knows the territory we're covering here, at least as well as anyone in the building. So let me ask you, Professor, how you see the backdrop to this. We'll come back to you on what's going to happen next. Please.
So let me just make a few corrections to the two gentlemen have exposed things very analytically. There are few gaps. One of the gaps, just a remark before what the public in England is obviously completely uninformed, is completely held in the dark, completely made stupid, to say it frankly and open. You know my way. I am very blunt. They have no clue what's going on, and the government is happy with this because they can use what happens, for example, in Parsons Green to mobilize, to get funds for certain projects, and to put the blame on someone else, where the blame to 80-90% goes on their back. Let's go back a little bit in history. Actually, matter is even older. Let's go to the Saudi regime in its inception, the first Saudi state, which we call in our radio broadcast, or weekly radio broadcast, which stopped for some external reasons a year ago. We call the first Daesh, the first ISIS, because this ISIS is the second. The first Saudi state, which is an unholy alliance between a local ruler of a small, insignificant village and Muhammad ibn Wahhab, was as brutal and as bloody as ISIS. Most people do not know that, but this is testified by their own historians, like Ibn Ghannam. Just to give one example of the brutality. They entered Sihat. This is a small town in the eastern region, mostly obviously Shia. For the Wahhabi Shia are kafir and mushrik, are pagans. So they treated them like pagans in the state of war and exterminated everyone. Ibn Ghannam says they killed everyone, 1,500 people, men and women. He doesn't mention children, but it's rationally inconceivable that there have been no children there. And he doesn't mention that children have been sold in the slave market, which would have been the tradition at that time. So most likely children would have been exterminated. So that's even super ISIS. This alliance was spread in Arabia, caused problem for the Ottoman Caliphate, which is very beneficial for Britain. That's the reason that they communicated with the third ruler of that entity, Saud, the son of Abdulaziz ibn Muhammad bin Saud, so the third in line. And they have an exchange with him, and he assured them that he is against the pirates operating in the Gulf. The pirates were another Wahhabis, the Qawasma, which are now part of Emirates. So he was against the pirates, exactly like Saudi Arabia now, cooperating against the pirates, against his own ideology, which shows clearly that the Saudi royals, not only the recent ones, even the first generation, the first Saudi state is cooperating with the British, and the British were happy because what would that produce? It will produce an undermining and weakening of the Khilafah Uthmaniyya, which was starting really to show signs of weaknesses, starting to go to bed. So the sick man of Europe 1 century later, ready to die. Ibn Saud himself, just correction to the history, he said, actually is a creation, the Abdulaziz, the founder of the current kingdom, is a creation of the British. He was in Kuwait. He was grown up by Mubarak al-Sabah, a prime British agent, no doubt about that. Mubarak al-Sabah disengaged from the Turks, the Ottomani, and made an alliance with the British, got protectorate status, and he is the one who brought Abdulaziz up and educated him. Abdulaziz was sent by the British. The main purpose for the British, they don't care the less about that desert. To the hell with the desert and the inhabitants. They don't care. Let us say, the British will say the British politician, not the British public. Let us make that clear. The British politician, since maybe 2-3 centuries, represent only a certain ruling elite and oligarchy and finance interest. They don't represent the simple man. But the simple man has to be taken on board because the simple man is the one who was dying in the trenches in the First World War, and hundreds of thousands of them. Indeed, so the simple man must be taken on board, otherwise the state will not function. But was taken by deception, by giving him an image of the world which is not true. Go back to Saudi Arabia. Abdulaziz was given free hand to essentially to kick and stab in the back of the Uthmani. Publicly, he was a Pasha of Najd appointed by the Khalifa in Istanbul, but secretly he was cooperating with the British. Later on, when the Sharif in Mecca, who cooperated with them, rebelled because they did not deliver on their promise to establish an Arabic kingdom, etc., they regarded Abdulaziz as a tool to remove him and kick him out of Hijaz. And thus, this way, Saudi Arabia was created and established. Later on, oil exploration done by the British were miraculously unsuccessful. And Abdulaziz, when Britain was under squeeze because of the rising of Hitler, was demanding more money, more money. He wants money, money, money. And the British were fed up. Churchill communicated to them and said, please take this guy. And we have no objection that
what a historic blunder that was. I'm going to stop you there, but after this break, it's right back to you. I'm George Galloway. This is كلمة حرة. You're watching كلمة حرة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, discussing ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and in the next two segments, what we're going to do when they come home from the war. But here's some more vox pops from the British public. Take a look at this.
How do you feel about the former ISIS supporters that went from Europe to the Middle East to work with them and support them, returning back to Europe again?
Yeah, I think particularly the UK government has got to be very careful on that sort of thing, to ensure that they don't go, first of all, and to ensure they don't get radicalised, first of all.
What do you think about volunteers going to Israel and fight there on the Jewish side? And when they come back, they're heroes, yes? These people, they go to the Middle East, low IQs, people that are not stable in their lives.
Well, I think if they want to come back, they shouldn't be accepted here, because you don't know what's their state of mind, you know, and because they did wrong by supporting or by being on their side.
Yeah, I think it's really sad that people would support that, and I don't think that they should be allowed here. So they should do something to prevent that.
So you think the people that went from here to join ISIS shouldn't be allowed back in the UK?
Absolutely, yeah.
If you want to go help, go. It's your life. And if you want to come back, you have Europe citizens, so come back. Okay. And if you need help, let them help you psychologically.
Yeah, maybe if they would accept them, they should be organizations that take care of them and look closely to what they are doing.
You don't know the individuals that are involved or anything like that as well. It's hard. It's difficult to say what the answer would be for that one, to be honest.
When they come back to Europe, do you think there will be a higher risk of terrorism?
Nah. You put thieves in the prison and they become more violent. Put a thief between normal people, maybe they will get normal again.
Wow. Professor Muhammad, you and I both know the kind of people who went to Syria and across the river into Iraq. And we know that not all of them have been or will be killed, and some of them are going to end up back here. How should we view that? With equanimity or fear?
It's very difficult because, for example, let me take the example of the recent couple of weeks ago bombing in Parsons Green. That was covered in the media as if the world is collapsing. The hurricanes in South America did not get that coverage. The earthquake did not get that coverage. So giving the general public that the world is turning around them, not turning around anybody else, that nobody else count as much as us. At the same time, no coverage whatsoever for the Rohingya disaster. No word from the British government in support. So this way you don't win the people's heart. If you cover these things properly and give the people the feeling that there are other human beings suffering, that you are caring about them, but this is purely academic and philosophical. It will never happen this way as long as the ruling system here is a capitalist oligarchic system with the mask of democracy.
Yeah, of course,
the best treatment for this is that what someone suggested, really to announce a general amnesty for everyone coming back and put them under supervision, make sure that they are re-educated if necessary. But how to re-educate? Who will do the education? You cannot take on board some of your agents, imams and so on, who blabber about the great virtues of Britain and this civilization. Must be people who give the people a critical, balanced point of view. This government committed mistakes. Yeah. They have to apologize. But what you did, going there and doing that, was not a proper thing to do. The proper thing was to be active here, politically, intellectually, philosophically. And possibly, if necessary, even participating in demonstrations, etc.
Let Mike, just before you do, of course, the victims of hurricanes and the victims in Burma are very important things, and I myself have spoken volubly about them. But my children could have been on that tube train. Yeah. So could yours. And
my son was 3 minutes
it would have been them. It would have been them that was 100% destroyed if they had been on that, in that underground carriage, if the bomb had exploded. So the idea of welcoming them back with a general amnesty and placing them into an as yet non-existent program where they could get the balanced re-education, that will not appeal to many British people, will it?
I don't think it will. And the numbers, as far as I've heard the number of 800, as that's the number of jihadis that have gone out, and 400 that have come back. 14 of those, I believe, may have been jailed. Whether those figures are completely accurate, I can't confirm. What I would say, though, is that these kids that are coming back, they're not all the same. You'll have some that are deeply disillusioned. You will have, and those you really want, I think you do want to welcome them back, and you want to facilitate them in any way that you can. You will have some that are disengaged from their old comrades, but who may be still sympathetic to them. Now, these are the people that you really have to consider, whether you want them back in the country, if they have come back, whether they should be put into special programs. You certainly don't really want to put them in prison. One of the big problems we've got in our jails at the moment.
It's the worst place to put them.
Absolutely the worst place. And then just one other group, and then please carry on. And that is, you will also have a few hardcore professionals. These are people of a different ilk altogether. And those are the people you really don't want at all in your country, because there's very little you'll be able to do about them.
One of the problems is, of course, how can you tell? This person who is on trial now for the Parsons Green outrage, he remains innocent, of course, until proven guilty. But if, as alleged by the prosecution, he carried out this crime, he came here as a 15-year-old and was welcomed and given a lot of state support as a child refugee, only if, as alleged, 3 years later, to carry out such an atrocity. Please.
I think one of the things which we fail to understand is that, we do believe that most of these individuals who've gone to fight, or to train or to travel to Syria and Iraq and all these areas, Somalia, these guys, don't have the required capacity to think. But we fail to understand that because, they're very, very strategic thinkers. These guys understand the foreign policies that, countries like UK, the big powers have. And they also do understand that, the big powers, are much more interested in actually maintaining their power and stability. That is why you would have, countries like the United States of America and the UK, favoring to have non-state groups, destroying other countries rather than have regimes which they table as rogue regimes. Because if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, it was because, the government, of the US government preferred, to have, the Taliban rather than have, the USSR within the region, which is a geopolitical strategy. The same applied to Iraq, the same applied to Syria. So we still have the same kind of mistakes which the foreign governments are making, which the UK is still making. So then what happens is that you still continuously have individuals. We live in a multicultural society where we do accept people from different countries. So these people would see the injustice that is applied to them, and they will want to move and travel to these other countries. We're not saying it's a good thing to become a fighter of ISIL, but what we're saying is as long as the foreign policies, as my colleagues have said, does not change, we would still have these guys coming in, irrespective of the numbers, whether they're 500 or they're 100 or they're 50 or 20, we would still have them coming in. But what can you do? What you can do is, first of all, to identify them. How do you identify them when these people live in communities that the government does not trust? In order for you to be able to approach or to be able to find out about these individuals, you have to show some trust within the communities which they live in. But that, at the moment, is not existing.
No, it's not existing in either direction. Let's take our friend here.
I just wanted to support what was said before, and which means that the fact that the different governments in the West have been supported and creating all this chaos. We all remember the former French foreign policy who was saying that al-Nusra was doing a good job in Iraq and in Syria. So that was Laurent Fabius. He was saying this 2 years ago. And so that shows that the involvement of foreign government in chaos. Another thing is also you've got this very important corporation, Lafarge, a French company, that was signing contracts with ISIS after it was well known that ISIS was a terrorist group. And no one is doing anything about this. No one is asking Lafarge, okay, you did something wrong. So these are two facts. Another thing I think, what I would like to add here is about when we look at all these terrorist groups in the Middle East and African continent and having an impact here in the West, we do not always think about the reason why all this is happening. And there's one notion I would like to put in the debate. That's the notion of imperialism. Very often we see just one form of imperialism. In my opinion, there are different forms of imperialism. You've got the imperialism, of course, of the West, but we must not deny that in Arab countries, and very often there's a form of imperialism. When I was doing my research on the Muslim community in Britain, I came across lots of Muslims who had this nostalgia of before 1929, when you had a caliphate, a Muslim empire. And I know that for some Muslim, I'm for the, let's say the progression of Islam. I would like everyone to adopt Islam and like Islam, but there's a way to do it. When you put imperialism, which means that using religion for imperialistic objectives, it doesn't work. And I think that we've got to listen to ourselves and try to think if the reason why we've got some Muslims knowing that in fact they are being manipulated and but accepting the deal, if there is not a form of imperialism. If there is some countries, they would maybe like to have the whole African continent Muslim, but Muslim, and they decide, and they are like their slaves. So this is not acceptable.
Well, you see, the central dilemma for, let's deal with Britain, for British politicians, I'm not sure that many of them are trying. I'm certainly trying. I'm trying to change our policy abroad and defend our people from the consequences of that policy at home. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. There are many people, especially on the left, like you and me, who are only concerned about changing the foreign policy. There are plenty of people on the right who are only concerned with dealing with the consequences of that foreign policy. But as one could not exist without the other, it seems to me obvious that both have to be tackled simultaneously. I ran to be Mayor of London. If I were the Mayor of London now, I would have the duty now of defending our underground trains, making sure our police were up to the job of tackling the consequences of our foreign policy. I would not immediately be able to change our foreign policy, though I would always, of course, be trying to. You see, the dilemma I'm describing here is not a simple one. It's necessary, but not sufficient, to challenge our foreign policy and to defend our people. Both are required. But Professor Mohammed made the point, and I know this to be true, I suspect you do also. Even if we wiped Western foreign policy, there would still be the kind of forces that you are describing,
yes,
who aggressively pursue essentially an imperialist strategy, this time a Muslim imperialist strategy. They say that we want to make a caliphate, whether you like it or not. That would continue to exist, even if Britain had the foreign policy of Cuba.
Yeah.
That's the dilemma that we have, isn't it?
Yes, it is, definitely, yeah. And for me, the one thing that disappoints me a lot is what's happening like in Africa at the moment, which means that there is a system which is the legacy of the Nazi regime, the French currency. I'm talking about franc CFA. And we know that normally everyone should be blaming and not dealing with France because they are applying this system, this monetary system on African countries, and you see people like Muslim countries like Qatar investing in le PSG. So that's
I want to come back to these satrapies in the Gulf and their role in this, and whether they can play a role in dealing with the consequences. But after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, here on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing an issue that literally crosses all the continents. Let's go to the backbenches and hear from the distinguished-looking gentleman there. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir. George, it's just a quick question, really, just to give you the scale of the amount of money that the British government has been putting into destabilising Syria, which perhaps should be reflected in a de-radicalising programme. And, you know, I'd be interested to compare and contrast the figures that would be used to resettle some of the returning ISIS people. But this was a question that was answered in the House of Lords on Britain's involvement in Syria and the funding of the Syrian quote-unquote opposition. The British government put £60 million annually into destabilising Syria. This came from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Department for International Development and the Ministry of Defence. So the money's there. We have a responsibility. We have helped radicalise and mobilise people through and into Syria, as we know from actions in Manchester with the Libya Islamic Fighting Group. Some of the consequences of blowback and the lifting of restrictions by the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister Theresa May. But £60 million was given to do this. Some of it was including education, basic policing and search and rescue services. Search and rescue, I presume, would be the white helmets, or the much lauded Oscar-winning white helmets run by MI6, as we know, and awarded by Hollywood with every kind of award that they can do. But £60 million can be found.
Yes. Although £60 million, Charles, is a drop in the ocean, isn't it? It's a drop in the ocean for the ISIS-Al-Qaeda front, which has received, I would estimate, in the small billions from the Gulf satrapies of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates and elsewhere. Charles, is this not one way to go? Shouldn't the people who pay for the reconstruction of Syria and for the dealing with all these jihadists be the people who largely paid for them in the first place. Why shouldn't they be resettled in Saudi Arabia?
It's an ironic feature, and of course there are many, sadly, tragically ironic features of the Syria war, as indeed with all of this situation we've been discussing, that the countries that have contributed, for example, the most to causing the war in Syria, picking up on what Mike said, of what I said earlier, that, of course, countries outside of Syria, as indeed Libya and elsewhere, take advantage of further their own interests. So I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been a revolt in Libya anyway. There may or may not have been, but it would have been a tiny thing compared to this war that has killed 400,000 people, created 6 million refugees and so on. But an ironic feature of that is that some of the countries that have so, for their own geopolitical interests, fostered that war in terms of funding and arming, Saudi Arabia is the main one, Turkey until recently has been another, have been amongst the least generous. I would have to take Turkey out of that equation for this, actually, in dealing with the consequences, the human consequences in terms of refugees, but also in terms of de-radicalization programs and so on. Now, Saudi Arabia, it has a much lauded and vaunted de-radicalization program, but one wonders, and people are looking into this a bit more, shall we say, in a bit more detail now, not accepting the Saudis' version of the success of these programs, whether in fact people are just being released from these programs and are still radicalized, or perhaps even more so.
Professor Mohammed, you mentioned in passing earlier, and I happen to know exactly what you're referring to, the professional prevent industry in Britain, the tame mullahs who will utter the liberal mumbo jumbo for money. They're not going to de-radicalize anyone, are they? Because no one trusts them or gives them any credibility at all.
Anyone asks me, should I join a program? They said, we are clear from these traitors. These have nothing to do with Islam. They are as bad to Islam as Saudi Arabia, as the British government. We are clear from them. This employing these people will backfire because they are easily exposed. The moment it defies any logic that you go to such a program and find a mullah or imam claiming it's okay to grass on Muslims and inform MI6 or MI5. That's simply not possible, especially in Islamic frame. Islam is oversensitive about spying. We are calling permanently. I appeal to Morsi, for example, Mohammed Morsi, the Egyptian president, to abolish the state security apparatus completely and make that as a revolutionary step forward in the future, which will really undo the history. This is very idealistic, I know. Will undo the history of the 100 last years where security services have become custom. Actually, in America, the CIA is not accepted. If they visit any campus, in my time in America in the 80s, they visited the Colorado University campus and they were thrown with eggs out of the campus. The public resent those politically organized and politically spying. Maybe spying on foreign enemies and so on may be acceptable due to military necessity, but not inside the country.
Mike Yardley.
Yeah, let me ask.
Imagine I'm the Mayor of London. You're my advisor. What are we going to do?
Okay, on that front, what are these kids looking for? They're looking for respect. They're looking for identity. They're looking for adventure. So I think not just the kids who have gone abroad, not just the kids who are being radicalized at the moment, you have to recognize that and create something that's going to appeal to young people. And in doing that, make them see the fantastic values that we have in this country. It's not without its flaws. We know that, some of our imperial ambition, some of our corporate greed, whether it's in the UK or the US, has exacerbated many of these problems. But that said, this is a fantastic country, and I don't think we're very good at packaging our values. So I think part of it is better packaging of values.
I would like to talk to you. Would you just say something to me, if you could pass it along, please? I just want to ask you, as a young woman living in a Western country, are you afraid of these people? Are you afraid of them returning?
Yeah, I am. Definitely.
Tell me.
Well, I think they could affect other people and other people's views as well. So yeah, I am scared.
Well, I think she's right to be, you see. With all respect to my old friend, Professor Mohammed, it isn't true that all of these people are disinterested or uninterested in our way of life and changing it. It isn't true. I know, and you know, people who don't believe that this girl should be sitting in this room with all these men. we both know people who don't think that gay people have any rights. We both know people who curse what they call the liberalism of Western society. Now, they're entitled to dislike it and curse it. The problem is when they want to harm it and when they want to harm. You and I know someone very, very well who, when a woman brought her daughter to come and see them to talk about a future medical career, he insisted upon speaking to her through a wall. We know that these people exist and that they don't think that a young girl like that should be here. And if she's here, she certainly shouldn't be speaking up. Isn't that right?
Can I just say one thing on that?
Yes.
It's a very interesting point you raised and that you've raised and that I've spotted even just as an observer that hasn't received much media attention. I see that in the Finland attack recently that killed several people, in the London Bridge attack, these attackers seem to be targeting young women. In these attacks, if you look at the casualty figures, it's young women and then men that went to help. And I absolutely agree with you that they are, in addition to issues of foreign policy, they are attacking what they see to be the way of life.
You see, I denied this for many years, Mohammed. I denied it for many years, but I can no longer deny it.
No, I think this attack is most like because women are a softer target than men, generally, physiologically. That is easy to attack with knives. I don't think it has to do with that. The woman is covered.
It is about soft.
Soft target is not this. But this type of people exist. It has to be discussed intellectually with them inside the Muslim community, and it's ongoing now for decades. But the ruling elite in Britain, for example, let me give an example. Prior to the panorama, the famous panorama after 7/7 in 2005, we had a very lengthy interviews made with, I don't remember his name, the BBC man who introduced himself as an objective man who wanted to give the public a structured, well-developed point of view with all aspects. And we have many sessions of recording. That was on the advice of Yasser Steady from Islamic Observation Center. He pressurized me to do that. I don't trust the BBC. They are not trustworthy. He said, no, they have given undertaking and they are honest and they're sincere. So we did that at length. Unfortunately, 7/7 happened. After that, the deputy director of this program, an Irish young man in his 20s, phoned me, say, Professor, I'm sorry, it seemed to be our agreement has been broken. They are going to make a panorama which is evil, mischievous, and negative. And they have resigned. He has resigned. I don't remember his name, but I have still some of his communications. Then you have seen the panorama. It shows only the negatives, did not give a structured point of view because the ruling elite need to justify to the people. Even interviews in the underground, many people expressed, some people kept saying, this is our policy in Iraq, it's coming back to haunt us. They were muzzled. So the problem is that there's no open discourse. Anyone having an open discourse is not encouraged to have it unless he says, God bless the British government, bow to the British government. But that is not possible. The same what the Saudis want us to do. Praise them for some few infrastructure things they did and forget about their all evil. That's not acceptable. Islamic campaign are fundamentally politically oriented because Islam has solutions for society and state. This seems to be a well-worn out jargon, but that's the truth. They have to address these issues, but the powers to be, they are muzzling the people. I am not invited by the BBC, etc., except if it fits their agenda, and that's the reason I'm refusing since almost 12 years to appear. Told them I'm not appearing in your program since the 7/7 affair and the panorama because you are not clean, you are not honest. You are dishonest exactly like Arab media, but you are more intelligent. The Arab media are stupid, that's all. But you are as dishonest and as insincere as those. You don't cover things properly and you don't represent things properly.
Well,
so
look,
we have a dilemma. You have a real
Did
problem.
you want to make a quick point? Yes, please.
The issue of our way of life, we hear this quite a bit in America, Germany, France, in England. You hear this a lot. But I think way of life, it should be two ways. It should be both sides. Everyone should respect the other way of life. The way I see it is a little bit of supremacy when it comes to from the West. They always say it's our way of life, like it's the only way of life. They don't respect other people's way of lives as well. I was born in this country, I came in this country, I learned the culture in this country, I respect what they do, I don't criticize. Whatever I don't like, I won't do it, right? Because that's their way of life, right? But if other people go to those countries as well, they should also respect
their ways of life. It should be on a level playing
There's
field.
no doubt about that. We're destroying other people's countries, never mind their way of life. But just because of that doesn't mean that the corollary isn't also true. I'll give you a quick example in my own life. My wife co-presents a television program with me every week. I have a steady stream of people with Muslim names demanding that she be more modestly dressed. As a Muslim woman, why is she not wearing a hijab? What's your business whether she's wearing a hijab or not? It's her business. It's my business. It's not your business. But every week, the same names maintain that kind. Now, that's our way of life. And I don't appreciate other people trying to change it. You get my point. Yes, sir. You may be the last speaker. Go ahead.
All right. So, Mr. Galloway, I've seen lots of your speeches on YouTube with yourself and your wife as well on Sputnik and on RT and Press TV. And it's really good to see you here today in person. So I have a question that perhaps maybe you could answer and one of our distinguished experts could answer as well. Now, we spoke today about Britain being one of the major exporters of these job seekers turned adventure seekers, terrorists, but they don't only come from Britain, they also come from other countries. Some of the countries that are much larger, much more complex, for instance, Russia and Kazakhstan. But then somehow when I look at Russia and Kazakhstan, they manage to deal, their security services, their police manage to deal with the returnees in such a way that you rarely get any major terrorist acts. There might maybe one or two, but then here in Britain, where we have one of the best secret services, police services, it seems that just this past year we had 4 or 5. So I just want to know why. What is your view on that? And
well, the Russians have got quite a good security service too. They have for quite a long time. And I've no doubt that there's nobody proposing funding a liberal re-education policy for their returnees. Their punishment is likely to be swifter and more condign. I agree with Mike Yardley earlier in the program when he said, I don't know what we're going to do about the future. I was hoping that out of this debate today might emerge a strategy which rang a bell for me and which pointed a way forward, but it didn't. And that's no criticism on the audience, nor I think a criticism of me. These are very intractable problems. And the one thing that is for sure is that we haven't seen the last of them. Literally, last words, Mike Yardley.
This gentleman made a very good point. If British and US corporate greed and imperialism is one thing behind all of this, another, I think, is the perception of a lack of respect by the Muslim world from us. I think that is deep-rooted into this problem. Respect.
Respect indeed, and a very good note to end on. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة for Al Mayadeen Television.